That night, the sound of shattering glass was no louder than a sharp intake of breath. Yet the entire banquet hall fell instantly silent. Over 200 people paused mid-sentence, their smiles frozen, their eyes all fixed on the same spot, a man kneeling to pick up the broken pieces from the stone floor. He didn't look up. He knew this feeling all too well. When the spotlight shines on the smallest mistake of a hired hand, the room treats it as the opening act. No one asks if his hand hurts. They just wait to see if he's trembling enough to drop something else. The man in the center of the hall pushed back his chair, the sound of its legs scraping the floor loud enough to punctuate his presence. He held his wine glass with 2 fingers, gave it a slight swirl, and his voice, not loud but perfectly pitched to reach every ear, said, "You spill before you've even finished cleaning. Around here, you have to have rhythm. If you have rhythm, prove it." He glanced around, signaling. The manager seemed to understand but dared not move. A series of cold, sharp gazes swept over the kneeling man. His name was Noah Brooks, 32 years old, a night shift cleaner at this hotel for only 4 weeks. Before he signed the contract, they had told him to walk softly, speak only when necessary, appear and disappear like air. Noah understood. He had been doing that his whole life. There was one detail no one here knew. 8 years ago, in this very hall, he had sat at the piano against the west wall and brought the entire room to its feet in a standing ovation. That night, he hadn't seen contempt. He had seen hands reaching out to him, heard people calling his name, asking for photos, asking where he had studied. Then life had taken a turn as sharp as a dry cough, and since then, he had learned to be silent. Even as he walked across this same stone floor every night, he reminded himself not to look at the piano. The man in the center of the hall was Richard Hale, the chairman of an investment fund, the man whose face was in most of the photos in the hallway for sponsoring all sorts of events. He wasn't famous for his expertise. He was famous for not bothering to hide his disdain. Richard raised his glass. "There's a piano. You say you have rhythm, so go sit at it. If you can play a single decent piece, I'll donate all of tonight's tips to the cleaning staff. If you can't, you will kneel and apologize to every single table. Is that clear?" The crowd laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the laugh of people who were tired of the wine and needed someone else's humiliation to feel something. A few phones were raised, tilted slightly to find the best angle. A waiter at a table near Noah quickly brought over a dustpan. He looked at Noah and frowned, as if to say, "Don't," but didn't dare to speak. The manager leaned in close and whispered, "You don't have to do this. I'll apologize for you." Noah shook his head. He placed a piece of broken glass in the dustpan, stood up, and wiped his hands on a cloth. No one noticed the long scar running from his wrist to his elbow, the old scar of someone who had once practiced the piano to exhaustion, who had rushed between 2 jobs and fallen, who had thought he would never touch the keys again. "Go on, sit," Richard said, as if ordering his personal musician. "I want to see what someone with rhythm looks like." He emphasized the word rhythm like a joke. The guests at the nearby tables clinked their glasses, their eyes alight with the promise of a spectacle. Evan, Richard's son, who had been silent until now, started to say something but stopped. He opened his mouth, then closed it, like someone who didn't want to add fuel to the fire, but couldn't find any water. Noah didn't rush. He glanced around the hall, a brief look, just long enough to remember that this place had once held applause for him. The atmosphere tonight was different. No one was calling his name. No one was inviting him closer to get a better look. He was just the man who had spilled a drink. And that was exactly what Richard wanted. To push a person who was already being treated as invisible into the spotlight, to remind everyone that some people were born to bow down. If you have ever been at a party or a meeting where someone deliberately highlighted your mistake like that, you know how empty and cold this feeling is. It doesn't scream, it just constricts. If a part of this story touches you, please leave a line in the comments. Maybe down there, someone who has knelt like you, like Noah, will see each other and find it easier to stand up. And, if you think stories that dare to name injustice need to be told, you can stay connected with this channel so you don't miss anything important for yourself. Noah walked toward the piano. No one applauded him. No one introduced him. A technician stood by the piano, ready to close the lid if this impromptu entertainment lasted longer than 10 seconds. Noah didn't sit down immediately. He placed his hand on the lid of the piano and took a short, sharp breath, just enough to control his breathing. In his mind, there were no grand titles or old photographs. There was only his mother's face. The small, damp room where he once had a battered old piano, the nights he had played so softly so the neighbors wouldn't complain, the mornings he had folded his janitor's uniform and put it in his backpack before the sun came up. He opened the piano lid with a simple motion. Richard pursed his lips. "Hurry up, don't keep us waiting." A guest said, "Let's see how many notes he can hit." Another added, "Probably a few seconds." "I bet 10 seconds. They didn't bother to whisper. The point was for the man at the piano to hear. The hall manager forced a smile, his voice trembling. "Ladies and gentlemen, please." Richard cut him off. "Let him prove himself." Omar, the old security guard, stood at the back of the hall, his hands clasped behind him. He looked at Noah as if he had seen him somewhere before, trying to remember, but said nothing. Evan's eyes were still fixed on Noah's hands. There was something about them that he couldn't look away from, a kind of quiet that didn't match the role of the nuisance. Evan glanced at his father and saw a familiar kind of amusement, the kind that had driven many people out of the company because they couldn't stand this kind of humor. He tapped his fingers lightly on the edge of the table, as if to ground himself. Noah sat down. He touched the keys lightly, not to show off, but to check their weight. The crowd chuckled. "He's acting like a maestro." The comments washed over him like cold water. Not painful, just cold. He placed his hands in a position he had placed them hundreds of times before. He didn't need much. Just the rhythm. Just his own rhythm, not the one others demanded. The first note rang out, clear, direct, without any flourish. The hall tilted slightly toward the sound, more out of habit than respect. Then the second and the third. Noah didn't flinch. He let the rhythm flow, like steps on a flat road. Not fast to show off, not slow to beg. Richard raised an eyebrow. Evan stopped tapping his fingers. Omar took a small step forward. The people who had just raised their phones to record a clumsy janitor now suddenly had to adjust their angle, because the face in the frame was no longer so ridiculous. It was becoming serious. Noah didn't look at anyone. He didn't even look at the piano lid, reflecting the hall lights. He thought about the emptiness inside him, about the days he had worked 3 shifts just to make rent, about the time he had placed his hands on the keys of a church organ and played a short piece for a child who had fallen asleep in a pew, about the only feeling that reminded him he was alive, a direct, unadorned vibration. Here, now, he didn't need the right name for the piece. He needed the right truth. A series of notes rose above the jokes. At the third table, a woman stopped laughing. At the fifth, 2 men paused mid-conversation. The atmosphere shifted very slowly, like the way day turns to night. No one clapped. No one praised him. But the scraping of chairs lessened. The clatter of silverware subsided. Richard said nothing for 15 seconds, a rare occurrence. Evan set his glass down, and the whole hall heard the sound of glass on the table. Omar glanced at the manager and signaled him not to approach the piano. Noah held the rhythm as if it were a promise to himself. In the middle section, he increased the pressure on his right hand, not for show, but so that those farther away could hear the melody clearly. He wasn't trying to tell a story with 10 different techniques. He was telling it with something everyone could understand. A person standing tall just before being forced to kneel. Toward the end, he softened, not tying it off with a dramatic flourish, but with a pause that was just enough, like an exhale. Silence. Not an awkward silence. It was the silence of people realizing they had just done something they shouldn't have. Turned a person into a spectacle. Richard flicked his fingers as if to brush the feeling away. He laughed. Good, good. The cleaning staff gets their tips tonight. His voice was light, patronizing. He turned to the crowd. Everyone, a round of applause for, what's his name? He looked at Noah without waiting for an answer. A thin, rushed round of applause broke out, like people checking off a box. Noah stood up, closed the piano lid, and nodded. He didn't bow in a subservient way. He just nodded. Richard raised his glass and added, "You can go back to your work now. Remember to clean up that spot on the floor." He said it slowly and clearly, to end the scene by reminding Noah of his place. Noah looked at him directly, without aggression. "I will clean it. And I will also ask you to keep your word. As publicly as you made the challenge, you said you would donate all of tonight's tips to the cleaning staff." Richard raised an eyebrow, a flash of annoyance. "Of course." He turned to the manager. "Gather them up and count them." The way he said count made the manager break into a sweat. The hall's attention shifted away from the piano as the uncomfortable feeling began to fade. A few people started talking and laughing again. A few glanced at Noah, as if to check if he was being arrogant. Evan walked over and said in a low voice, I'm sorry for how that happened." He looked around, then said quietly, just for the two of them to hear, "You played well. I don't know if that helps." Noah replied, "Thank you." He didn't smile. He didn't need praise. He just needed the bare minimum. For a promise to be kept. Evan nodded, about to say something more, but Richard called out, "Evan, come here." His voice wasn't loud, but it was heavy. The kind of voice that often cut off decent conversations. Evan went, his face hardening. A young waiter quickly touched Noah's arm and whispered, "That was amazing." He pulled his hand back as soon as he saw Richard glance over, looking afraid of being caught. Noah understood that look. He had seen it many times. The look of someone who wants to be on your side, but is held back by the unspoken rules of the room. This wasn't the first time, but tonight was different. Tonight, too many phones had been raised, and too many people had heard the words, "Kneel," and apologize to every single table. Noah returned to the spot of the broken glass, knelt down, and picked up the last, smallest pieces. He worked carefully, as if he were putting away something precious. The manager leaned in. "I'm sorry about that. I tried." Noah replied, "It's okay." He said it not because he forgave him. He said it because he knew this manager was also afraid of losing his job. Omar approached from a distance and stopped. "You did well," he said directly, his eyes on the floor. "If you need someone to confirm what he said, I'm here." Noah nodded. He wasn't planning on making a scene. He was just going to do his job, clean up, and then keep a private record in his mind of what had just happened. Just then, Richard raised his glass again. He seemed afraid the room was getting dull and wanted to add another layer. "All right, he can play the piano. But you said rhythm, and I want to see if you can hold the rhythm of the entire room. I'll make you a deal. After the auction, you will stand at the back of the hall and give a thank you speech on behalf of your team. If the people here give you a standing ovation, I'll sign off on a quarterly bonus for the entire team. If they ignore you, you will apologize to every table for the interruption, okay?" The room stirred. Some laughed, as if they had just been given a second dessert. Others looked at Richard, unsure if this was still a game or just bullying. Evan spun around. "Dad," Richard held up a hand. "Don't." He looked at Noah, waiting for an answer. The air was dry and sharp, like the edge of a freshly cleaned glass table. The gazes were once again focused on one spot, waiting for one person to speak for them all. Noah stood up and wiped his hands on a cloth. He looked at the piano, then around the hall, his eyes pausing on Omar, on the young waiter, on the manager, and then finally on Richard. "You want me to speak for my team?" "Yes." "All right, but I'll do it my way." Richard smiled. "As long as you get them to applaud. Any way you can. If you have ever been in a situation where you had to speak for a group of people no one bothered to listen to, you understand how heavy this step is. If you have any small tricks for how to make a disrespectful room quiet down and listen, I want to read them below. Stories from real experience always save someone who is standing alone in front of cold eyes. And if you want to stay and see how a janitor uses what he has no tricks, no frills to turn a room around, you can stay connected with the channel. Here, we tell the story until the question, "What will happen?" is no longer a question, but proof that dignity can win. Richard turned back to the main table and signaled for the MC to begin the next part of the evening. The voice on the stage was a blur amidst the whispers. Noah stood at the back of the hall, the spot people were least likely to notice. He didn't touch the backup microphone on the stand, didn't signal to anyone. He just stood straight, his hands still smelling of floor cleaner, his eyes on the piano as if to remember the rhythm. Omar stood by the door, his body slightly shielding Noah from any stray taunts. Evan was on the left side of the hall, his hands clasped, as if waiting for something others were trying to deny. The air was thick. No one was counting the seconds. No one thought this was the main event. But some moments draw the spotlight to themselves, not because they are loud, but because they are true. Noah took a breath, deep enough to hear his own voice more clearly than the clinking glasses at table 7. He lifted his chin slightly, and he began. Noah stood straight at the back of the hall. People had returned to their meals, to their laughter, but they kept a part of their attention on him, waiting to see what he would do next. He knew that tonight wouldn't end with just a few notes on the piano. Richard had set another trap, forcing him to speak in front of this room, to become the representative for the very people who were normally invisible. It wasn't just a joke, it was a test of whether he dared to exist in front of them. Noah didn't rush. He did his job, walking between the tables, clearing a few glasses, wiping a wine stain from the floor. These simple actions made some people laugh. He can actually play, but he's back to wiping floors? But for Noah, cleaning up wasn't about bowing down. It was about keeping his word, keeping the rhythm in everything, even the smallest tasks. Omar still stood near the door, his eyes fixed on him. The old security guard had seen hundreds of parties, hundreds of loud scenes, but something about this was familiar. The hands, the posture at the piano, the way he didn't lower his gaze. It all took him back 8 years, to a night shift at an old theater. That night, a young artist had walked out, sat at the piano, and brought the entire audience to its feet. His name was on the program. Noah Brooks, the city's young piano prodigy. Omar remembered it clearly, and he also remembered, a few months later, a short news brief. Traffic accident. Young artist disappears from the stage. Future. Uncertain. Now, Omar saw the man holding a cleaning cloth, his back slightly stooped from years of work, but his hand still held the same steady grace. He didn't say anything. He just shook his head and sighed, like someone who was witnessing a secret no one else wanted to believe. Noah didn't want to think about 8 years ago, but as he set down the cloth, the images flashed in his mind. The blinding lights of his last performance, the screech of metal, the smell of smoke, the doctor's voice saying he would never play again. That sentence had taken everything. His fame, the invitations, himself. He had put away the piano, found any job he could, and had lived as someone else ever since. Richard, however, wasn't finished. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes alight with his new game. "Get him a microphone," he ordered. "I want to hear what he can say besides mopping floors." His table laughed. The MC was flustered, but didn't dare to object. A microphone was placed at the back of the hall. Noah looked at it, then back at the room. He knew this game was even harder than the piano. To make the music speak, he just needed his skill. But to speak, he would have to risk his pride. He remembered the faces of his colleagues in the break room, the tired faces after a long shift, the small stories cut short when a guest walked in, the dreams no one bothered to listen to. If he spoke tonight, he wouldn't just be speaking for himself. He would be speaking for them. And he knew that meant putting himself in danger. Evan, Richard's son, was still watching silently. He was used to his father's humiliating games. But this time was different. Maybe it was the way Noah had sat at the piano, not trembling as his father had expected. Maybe it was the music, which, though brief, had reminded him of something he had once read. True talent doesn't need an introduction. It forces people to listen. Evan wanted to say something, to stop his father, but Richard's sharp gaze locked him in place. A laugh came from a corner table. "Hurry up. We want to see the main event." "Not this joke," Richard laughed back. "This is my main event." He said it like a declaration of power. Noah walked to the microphone but didn't pick it up. He just stood beside it. He looked at each table, each face. A heavy silence fell over the room. Not everyone wanted to listen, but everyone was waiting to see how he would begin. "Thank you." His voice was low, clear, but not strained. "I am one of the cleaners here. My job is to pick up the broken pieces, to wipe the floors, to clear the tables, and I will continue to do that, because it is the job I chose." He paused, letting the whispers pass. "But tonight, someone asked me to prove my rhythm. I did. And now, he has asked me to speak for my team." Richard leaned back, his expression a mix of amusement and challenge. Noah continued. "I don't know the rhythm you all follow. I only know the rhythm we live by every day. It is the rhythm of starting our shift when the city is asleep, the rhythm of gathering the trash when the hall still smells of wine, the rhythm of mopping the floors before the sun comes up. No one applauds that rhythm. But if we were to stop for just one day, you would notice." The room shifted, not with applause, but with a change in their gazes. A few faces were confused. A few looked away. Evan sat up straighter. Omar clenched his hands behind his back. Richard frowned, like a man who had just been challenged in his own territory. Noah stopped, not drawing it out. "I don't need you to stand for me. But if you can, the next time you walk past one of us, just see us as if we exist." His voice dropped, surprisingly calm. The room was silent for a few seconds. Then, from a table in the middle, a woman began to clap slowly. The single clap was at first lonely, but then another joined in, and another. In a moment, the sound grew, filling the room. Not everyone, but enough to make Richard's face change. He slammed his glass on the table, the sound cold. "All right, that's enough. The fun is over." He cut off the applause, but he couldn't hide the truth. His joke had turned against him. Evan looked at his father, his expression no longer fearful but determined. Omar looked at Noah and gave a slight nod, a silent promise that he would stand with him if needed. Noah bowed his head in thanks and then returned to his work. He didn't need to say anything more. He knew tonight had changed something. Not because of a few claps, but because for the first time in 8 years, he had stood before a crowd, not as a disappeared person, but as a human being who was present. If you have ever had a moment where a single sentence, a single action, allowed you to reclaim your own existence, you will understand the value of this moment. If you have, please write it in the comments. Maybe your small story will become an inspiration for someone who thinks they no longer have a voice in this world. And if you want to continue following this journey, where the overlooked stand up to reclaim their own rhythm, remember to connect with the channel so you don't miss out. Richard remained seated, his face tense. He was used to winning, to turning others into a spectacle. But this time, the game had been flipped, and he knew this was only the beginning. The banquet hall was supposed to have returned to its usual rhythm, but it hadn't. A heaviness lingered in the air. People were still talking, still raising their glasses, but in the back of their minds, Noah's brief performance still echoed. They tried to forget, but it wasn't easy. Richard, however, refused to let it go. He was the kind of man who couldn't accept losing control, and when the room no longer played along with his jokes, he was even more determined to prove that it had all been a fluke, something of no value. He leaned forward and called out, "All right, let's be clear. A few notes on a piano don't mean anything. This entire room knows that. If you're so confident, sit down and play a full piece. A piece that anyone here would have to admit is valuable." He emphasized the last word with contempt. The crowd stirred again, half expectant, half skeptical. Someone laughed faintly. "Yeah, let's see. He can't hide now." Others were silent, uncomfortable, but not daring to object. Noah looked directly at Richard. He had no intention of turning the evening into a competition, but he understood, if he walked away now, everything he had just said would be dismissed as luck, an unfinished performance. He didn't want to prove himself to show off. He wanted to prove that his existence couldn't be so easily denied. He walked slowly toward the piano. All eyes followed him again. The air grew thick. No more clatter of silverware. No more loud laughter. Richard leaned back in his chair, a confident smile on his face. "Good. Now show us what you've got." Evan was tense, his eyes fixed on Noah, as if waiting for something he couldn't yet define. Omar clenched his hands, silently praying. Noah sat down. This time, no one laughed. No one filmed it as entertainment. The entire room was silent. He placed his hands on the keys, a long pause, as if the whole space were holding its breath. The first note rang out, deep and full. It wasn't the sound of someone just tapping the keys. It was the sound of someone who had lived with music, who had let his heart merge with every note. The second and third notes followed, smooth and firm. Gradually, a melody unfolded. Not too fast, not too flashy, but just enough to make the room listen. Noah wasn't thinking about Richard. He was thinking about his mother, who had once sat for hours just to hear him practice, who had once said, "Music will be your wings." He thought of the small room, where the light came through a crack in the door, illuminating the old piano keys. He thought of that fateful night, the accident that he thought had ended everything, and he thought of the 8 years he had lived as an invisible man, with no one remembering he had ever existed. All of that poured out in every note. The melody didn't just speak with music. It spoke with memories, with pain, with a fragile hope that had been rekindled. Gradually, the people in the hall began to change. The whispers died down. The phones that had been ready to record were quickly lowered, because everyone felt the absurdity of it in the face of what was happening. A few people even forgot to breathe. Richard sat up straight. He was no longer smiling. A look of alarm crossed his face, like a man witnessing something beyond his control. Evan leaned forward, his eyes bright, completely captivated by the music. Omar closed his eyes, letting the melody take him back to the nights at the theater, where he had stood guard by the back door and listened to Noah practice late into the night. Noah transitioned. The high notes soared, then descended into a soft, flowing current. This wasn't a practice piece. This was a story told in sound, a story of sleepless nights, of the sweat in his small apartment, of the times he had gritted his teeth as his trembling hands refused to obey, and a story of the determination to not give up, even when there was only the smallest chance. A sigh was heard from a corner of the room. Not of boredom. It was the involuntary sound of a heart being touched. Then another. The entire room was completely silent, filled only with the sound of the piano. For the final section, Noah poured all his strength into it. The keys leaped, powerful, pulling the entire hall into the rhythm. No one dared to think of him as just a janitor anymore. This was an artist, being reborn right before their eyes. He ended with a resonant chord, then released his hands and sat still, not bowing, not waiting for applause. The moment stretched for a few seconds, and then a single, firm clap rang out. Then two, then three, then the entire room rose to its feet, applauding nonstop. The applause was like a storm, crashing against the walls, against every person. Bravo! Incredible! Who is he? Cheers and praises filled the air, turning the room into a concert hall. Richard's face was pale. He couldn't believe what was happening. He tried to stand up and stop it, but the applause was too loud, drowning out any words he could say. Evan was on his feet, clapping relentlessly, his eyes never leaving Noah. Omar wiped the corner of his eye, silently recording every second in his memory. Noah remained seated, silent, taking a long, deep breath. He didn't need to look around. He knew what had just happened. After 8 years, he had been heard again, not as a name on a contract, but as a real person. If you are watching this, perhaps you, too, have a talent that others have dismissed, have been made to believe it no longer has value, but once it is brought out at the right time, in the right place, no one can deny it. If you have such a talent, I want you to write it in the comments. Don't keep it to yourself. Maybe someone listening will see themselves in your story. And if you believe that true talent never disappears, but only waits for the day to be revived, you can stay connected with this channel, where stories like this will continue to be told. In the crowd, a woman suddenly cried out, "I know him. He used to perform at the City Theater. Noah Brooks, right? The piano prodigy who disappeared after an accident that year." The whole room gasped. Many people nodded, remembering. "That's right. I've heard his name. I can't believe it. Is it really him?" Richard shot to his feet, shouting, "That's enough. This is just a fabricated story. No one here can confirm this." But his voice was lost in the sea of sound. Evan stepped forward, looked directly at Noah, and then said loudly, "Dad, it's not a fabricated story. I remember his name. I saw him perform when I was in high school. That's him." The room erupted. Cheers and murmurs filled the air. Omar came forward, his voice booming. "I can confirm it, too. I used to be a security guard at the theater. I saw him on stage. That is, Noah Brooks." Noah remained seated, not denying, not confirming. He let everything speak for itself. He didn't need any more words. And in that moment, Richard knew he had lost. The applause hadn't even died down when Richard roared, trying to regain control. He slammed his hand on the table, knocking over a wine glass, the red liquid staining the white tablecloth. "Silence!" he yelled, his voice strained, but the louder he shouted, the more his voice was lost in the wave of applause. The room no longer saw him as the center of attention. All eyes were on Noah, who was still sitting calmly at the piano, as if the noise had nothing to do with him. Evan stood up and moved closer. It was the first time he had publicly defied his father in front of so many people. "Dad, he's not lying. That's Noah Brooks. I saw him perform. I remember that night clearly. No one in the audience was still in their seat when he played." Evan's voice was clear and firm. The noise in the room subsided slightly, making way for a truth that was now erupting. Richard's face flushed. "Evan, sit down right now. You don't know what you're talking about. This is just a cheap trick he's pulling to fool you all. He pointed a finger at Noah, his voice trembling with rage. But when he looked around, he saw that he no longer had many allies. Some of the wealthy guests, who had been close to him, were now silent, avoiding eye contact. They didn't want to be on the side of a man who had just publicly humiliated an artist, especially one they had once praised. Noah stood up and walked to the center of the hall. He didn't need to raise his voice, but each word landed on the marble floor with a resounding echo. Mr. Hale, you were the one who asked me to prove my rhythm. You were the one who set the terms in front of everyone here. I didn't ask for this. I didn't beg for it. You issued the challenge, and I met it. Are you going to deny it now? The air in the room froze. An old man shook his head slightly. He's right. Another woman, still emotional from the performance, said loudly, "We all heard you, Richard. You were the one who made the deal. Are you going to back out now?" Her words were followed by a wave of agreement. The whispers turned into a loud murmur. Richard felt his power slipping away. He yelled, "That's enough. You're all being mesmerized by a few notes. Have you forgotten who he is? A floor cleaner, a hired hand. Don't let a piano piece make you forget his real place." That sentence was the final nail in his coffin. It exposed his complete arrogance, his discrimination, and his contempt for others. The room erupted in response. Some people muttered, "How despicable." Others shook their heads, and some took out their phones to record. The atmosphere had completely turned. Evan took another step forward, his voice uncharacteristically sharp. "Dad, that's enough. I can't stay silent while I watch you treat people like trash. I've put up with it for too long. Tonight, in front of everyone, I have to say this. I stand with him. I stand with Noah." The noise rose again. This time it wasn't mocking laughter. It was acknowledgement. Some of the guests started to applaud Evan. Richard spun around to face his son, his face pale. "Do you know what you just said? If you do this, you are no longer my son. You are out of this house, out of this company, out of everything." Evan didn't blink. "Good. At least I'll still have my self-respect." The words were a clean, decisive cut, and the hall exploded with murmurs. Noah looked at Richard, his voice calm, almost cold. "You've built your entire life on power and money. But tonight, in front of the very people you wanted to entertain, you've shown your true face. You can call me a janitor, you can call me a lowlife, but there is one thing you can't deny. I did what you said was impossible. And that will never go away." Richard was trembling, trying to argue, but the voices of dissent in the room grew louder. A guest stood up. "That's enough, Richard. This is no longer a party. This is a public humiliation. I can no longer do business with you." Another added, "Neither can I. I'm pulling my investment." Those words, coming from the very people who had once raised a glass with him, were like hammer blows. Richard stumbled back, lost his balance, and grabbed a chair, his face contorted with rage and fear. Meanwhile, Noah stood straight, needing to say no more. The weight of the truth and the music had been enough. Evan walked over to him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone." Noah gave a slight nod. Not smiling, but a look of determination in his eyes. He knew this battle wasn't about revenge. It was about asserting that dignity cannot be buried under the glamorous lights of those who think they are untouchable. If you are watching this, perhaps you, too, have witnessed a powerful person use their status to humiliate someone else. You may have been silent when it happened, but maybe today you will think differently. If you have ever had a moment where you wanted to stand up but didn't dare, please write it in the comments. Maybe your story will give someone else the courage, and if you want to continue following journeys where the powerless become the strongest in the room, please stay connected with this channel. This will not be the last story. Richard finally collapsed into his chair, his eyes vacant. The noise continued. But now, no one was paying attention to him anymore. They were all looking at Noah, the janitor, who had just stood up, not with power, not with money, but with his own talent and dignity. And everyone knew this was just the beginning of something much bigger. The banquet hall dissolved into chaos. The fake handshakes disappeared. The flattering smiles turned into cold glances directed at Richard Hale. The man who had once strode confidently through the upper echelons of society now sat slumped in his chair, his hands trembling, staring into space. He shouted a few more times, but no one was listening. The guests quietly left, some of them looking back at Noah with a mixture of respect and remorse. Evan stood by Noah's side, not leaving for a moment. He knew his decision meant he would lose everything his father had built. But when he looked into Noah's eyes and saw a calm that needed no validation, he knew he had made the right choice. Noah said nothing, just gave a slight nod, a silent acknowledgement of Evan's courage. Omar approached, his voice hoarse. "I've been waiting 8 years for this moment. They said you disappeared. But I always believed you would come back one day." Noah looked at him, a flicker of light in his eyes that quickly faded. "I didn't come back for the applause," he replied. "I just came back to remind them that we exist." The news spread faster than anyone could have imagined. The phones that had recorded the performance, the challenges, and the moment Richard lost control, all of it was shared on social media that night. Within a few hours, there were hundreds of thousands of views, tens of thousands of comments. Unbelievable. A genius buried for 8 years because of an accident? This is a true artist. Richard Hale should be ashamed. A rich man, but so empty. As it. The next morning, the major newspapers ran the story. Noah Brooks, the return of a piano prodigy. Richard Hale, from financial titan to public joke. The television channels replayed the video, analyzing every detail, every word. Media outlets called the hotel, trying to get in touch with Noah. And Noah? He showed up for his morning shift, in his old janitor's uniform, and mopped the hotel lobby floor, just like any other day. The manager stared at him in disbelief. You still came to work?" Noah smiled faintly. "The job's not done, so I have to finish it." Not a hint of arrogance. Just the calm of a man who knows who he is. Richard was a different story. He woke up in his mansion to a pile of newspapers at his door, his phone ringing off the hook with partners pulling their investments, the board demanding his resignation. His wife slammed the door and announced she was leaving. Everything he had built with money and power was crumbling in a single night. But what hurt him the most wasn't the canceled contracts. It was the cold gaze of Evan, his only son, who had now publicly turned his back on him. Meanwhile, music academies, theaters, and art centers were sending invitations to Noah. Some wanted him to perform again. Some wanted him to teach. Some wanted to make a movie about his life. But Noah turned down almost all of them. He knew that what he was looking for wasn't a glamorous stage. What he wanted was to use his music to remind people that everyone deserves to be heard. An elementary school in a poor neighborhood of the city sent him a handwritten letter in a child's scrawl. "Mr. Noah, can you teach us to play the piano? We don't have any money, but we can give you candy." The letter made Noah laugh, a real laugh, for the first time in years. He folded the letter, put it in his pocket, and called the school's principal. A few months later, in a small old room that had been converted into a classroom, Noah sat in front of an old piano that had been donated. Children sat around him, their eyes shining. He placed his hands on the keys and played a few simple notes. The children's eyes widened, and their small hands clapped along to the rhythm. Noah looked around and saw not an audience, but the future. Evan was there too. He had left his father's company and had started a community arts foundation. And his first project was the very class Noah was now teaching. "You changed my life," Evan said quietly to Noah after the class. Noah shook his head. Number. You changed your own life. I just reminded you that you could. Omar would sometimes stop by and sit in a corner of the room, watching the children practice. He often said, I used to guard the doors of fancy concert halls. Now, I feel more purpose guarding the door for these kids to learn music. As for Richard, he disappeared from public life. People said he was living in seclusion, consulting for a small company, with no one paying him any attention. In a few rare interviews, Evan would only say, he lost everything himself. No one took it from him. Noah's story didn't end with a night of applause. It began there, from a piece of music that silenced a room, to a fundraising movement for an arts class, to a small community center. There, poor children could learn to play, not to become geniuses, but to know that their voices, too, had value. If you are still here, listening to this, perhaps you understand. True revenge isn't about destroying the one who humiliated you. The most beautiful revenge is to prove that you can build something so good that it makes their cruelty seem small and meaningless. If you have ever been looked down on, please write your story in the comments. And if you want to continue to follow journeys that turn pain into strength, please stay connected with the channel. There will be more stories like this, and maybe next time, it will be your story. Noah stood in the middle of the classroom, listening to the children practice their first notes. They were clumsy, off-beat, but their eyes were bright. He smiled, placed his hand gently on the piano, and played a firm note to bring the class back to the right rhythm. He whispered, just loud enough for the children nearby to hear, Don't be afraid. Music will never abandon you. You just have to believe you can. Outside the window, the afternoon light streamed in. No more thunderous applause, no more blinding lights, just a man who had once been treated as invisible, now existing fully in the very rhythm he had chosen for himself. And that was the greatest victory of all.